Cody Montgomery sat in the dimly lit office of Dr. William Carter, his longtime physician and only friend in the world. The quiet hum of the air conditioning was the only sound in the sterile room, a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside Cody's mind. He sat stiffly in the leather chair, his fingers gripping the wooden armrests as if holding on to something tangible, something real. But nothing felt real anymore. Dr. Carter let out a deep sigh and folded his hands on the desk. His normally calm expression was overshadowed by the weight of what he had to say. "Cody, I won't sugarcoat this. The tests came back worse than I expected." He paused, watching Cody's reaction. "Your heart condition has progressed to its final stage. If you don't get a transplant or undergo intensive treatment, you only have a few months left." Cody blinked, but he didn't flinch. He had built a billion-dollar real estate empire by making decisions with cold precision, detaching emotions from outcomes. And yet, faced with his own mortality, there was no decision to be made. "So I'm dying," he said flatly, his voice void of emotion. Dr. Carter sighed again, rubbing his temples. "You could prolong your life with surgery, maybe even make it past a year. It's not hopeless, Cody. You have the resources for the best medical care in the country." "And what's the point?" Cody cut in. "Why fight to live when I have nothing worth living for?" The doctor leaned forward, frustration flickering in his eyes. "That's not true, and you know it." Cody let out a low chuckle, though there was no humor in it. "Come on, Bill. You and I both know I have no family, no wife, no kids." His voice turned bitter. "No heir. What am I supposed to do? Keep breathing just to sit in my penthouse and watch the world keep moving without me?" Dr. Carter clenched his jaw but said nothing. Cody stood abruptly, pacing toward the large window that overlooked the city skyline. New Orleans stretched beneath him, its vibrant chaos, the sharp contrast of wealth and poverty. He had spent his life buying and selling pieces of this city, but in the end, it all felt meaningless. His mind flashed to the countless people who had tried to manipulate him for his wealth. Business partners, so-called friends, women who only cared about his bank account. Not one person had ever truly cared for him. And so, he made his decision. Turning back to Dr. Carter, Cody's expression hardened. "I'm not wasting what little time I have left hooked up to machines." The doctor exhaled sharply. "So what then? You just wait for the inevitable?" A slow, grim smile formed on Cody's lips. "No, Bill. I'm going to find someone." Dr. Carter frowned. "Someone?" Cody nodded, his mind already racing. "I have all this money, all this power, and no one to leave it to. But if I can find just one person who actually deserves it, then maybe all of this won't be for nothing." Silence hung between them. Finally, Dr. Carter leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "And how do you plan to do that?" Cody smirked. "By becoming someone nobody notices." Dr. Carter narrowed his eyes. "What the hell does that mean, Cody?" Cody leaned against the desk, a glint of determination in his usually detached gaze. "I've spent my entire life surrounded by people who only see my bank account. If I stay Cody Montgomery, billionaire real estate mogul, all I'll find are more vultures circling my fortune." He straightened, adjusting his expensive cufflinks as if he were still the man he had been an hour ago. "But if I disappear, if I strip away all of this," he gestured vaguely to his tailored suit, the luxury watch on his wrist, the towering view of the city below. "Maybe I'll finally see who people really are." Dr. Carter ran a hand down his face. "So let me get this straight. You plan to what? Dress up as a homeless man and wander the streets hoping to find some worthy soul to inherit your empire? Something like that, Cody replied, the idea solidifying in his mind as he spoke. Cody, that's insane. Is it? Cody shot back. How else am I supposed to know if someone truly has a good heart? I don't want to hand my fortune to some charity that'll mismanage it, or to a business executive who'll use it to fuel their own greed. I need to see someone for who they are, not for what they want from me. Dr. Carter shook his head, his voice tight with disbelief. And what happens when you collapse in an alley because your heart gives out? Or when some gang decides to rob you blind? You think your money can save you out there? Cody smirked. That's the point, Bill. Out there I have nothing. No private security, no influence, no safety net. Just like everyone else scraping by on the streets. The doctor's expression hardened. You're playing a dangerous game, Cody. Cody shrugged. Maybe, but it beats sitting around waiting to die. Silence stretched between them. Finally, Dr. Carter exhaled heavily. If you're dead set on this ridiculous plan, at least do one thing for me. Cody raised a brow. What? Take this. Dr. Carter pulled open a drawer and retrieved a small heart rate monitor. Wear it. If anything happens, if your heart starts failing, you need to come back. Immediately. Cody took the device, rolling it between his fingers. He wasn't planning on coming back, but he owed Bill at least that much. Fine, he muttered, slipping it into his pocket. Dr. Carter sighed, shaking his head. This is madness. Cody smirked. Maybe, but it's my madness. Hours later, the beginning of disappearance. That night, Cody Montgomery walked into his penthouse for what he knew would be the last time. He took off his Rolex, setting it on the sleek black marble counter, slipped off his handmade Italian leather shoes, ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, knowing that soon it would be unkempt and greasy. Walking through his penthouse, he looked at everything he had built, the crystal chandeliers, the rare art pieces, the skyline stretching beyond the glass windows, and felt nothing. His life had been one of excess, but now it all seemed pointless. By sunrise, Cody Montgomery would be gone. In his place, there would be a nameless man, just another face lost in the streets of New Orleans. And with that, Cody picked up a set of old, ragged clothes he had bought earlier that evening. Clothes that smelled of dust and decay. Clothes that no billionaire would ever wear. As he changed into them, he didn't just shed his expensive suit. He shed Cody Montgomery, the man he had been for 55 years, and stepped into the unknown. The sun had barely begun to rise when Cody stepped onto the streets of New Orleans, his once polished shoes replaced by scuffed boots, his tailored suit now traded for a stained jacket and worn-out jeans. He moved through the city like a ghost, unnoticed, unrecognized. For the first time in his life, no one turned to greet him. No one sought his attention or approval. He had become invisible. The early morning air carried a damp chill, the remnants of last night's rain still pooling in the cracks of the sidewalk. Cody pulled his jacket tighter around himself as he wandered through the unfamiliar streets, past alleyways where men huddled for warmth, past store windows displaying luxuries that once meant everything to him, but now seemed meaningless. His stomach growled. He hadn't eaten since the night before, but there was no private chef waiting with a plated meal, no assistant ready to fetch him breakfast. If he wanted to eat, he would have to find a way. Near the French Quarter, Cody spotted a small cafe with a few customers sipping coffee inside. The scent of fresh pastries drifted through the air, making his hunger more unbearable. His first instinct was to walk in and order something, but of course that was no longer an option. He hesitated near the door, watching a man toss half a bagel into the trash outside. For a moment, a desperate thought crossed his mind, something he never imagined himself considering. The idea of reaching into the garbage for food made his stomach churn, not just from hunger, but from the sheer humiliation of it. "New around here?" a gruff voice called out. Cody turned to see an older man sitting on a bench, his gray beard thick and unkempt, his clothes layered and tattered. His piercing eyes, however, were sharp, too sharp for someone who had been beaten down by life. Cody hesitated before nodding. "Something like that." The man studied him for a moment before motioning to the bench beside him. "You look lost. Take a seat if you don't want to stand out too much." Cody sat, not because he wanted to, but because he had nowhere else to go. He needed to understand this world, and this man seemed to be a part of it. "Darnell," the man introduced himself, offering a hand. Cody took it hesitantly. "Cody," he said, then quickly corrected himself. "Just Cole." It was the first name that came to mind, and he realized instantly that he would have to get used to lying about who he was. Darnell chuckled knowingly. "All right, Cole. So, what's your story?" Cody paused. He had prepared for this, knowing he couldn't reveal the truth. "Just passing through," he said vaguely. Darnell smirked, shaking his head. "Yeah, sure you are." Darnell let out a dry chuckle, stretching his legs as he leaned back on the bench. "You ain't the first man to show up out of nowhere looking like you don't belong." His eyes flickered toward Cody's hands, clean despite the worn-out jacket, and the way he held himself. Too stiff, too alert. "You ever slept on concrete before?" Cody hesitated, but he knew the wrong answer could make him stand out even more. "I'll manage," he muttered. Darnell gave a knowing nod. "That's what they all say. First night's the worst. You don't know where to go, don't know who to trust, and by morning, you're either freezing, starving, or robbed blind." "Shtiti," he paused before gesturing toward an alley across the street. "Stick with me, Cole. I'll show you how to get through it." Cody wasn't sure why he accepted, but something about Darnell's demeanor told him this man knew survival better than anyone. He followed as Darnell led him through the back streets, weaving through pockets of people sleeping under makeshift shelters. The stench of damp cardboard and stale alcohol clung to the air, mixing with the distant scent of food from the restaurants that hadn't yet opened for the day. Darnell stopped near a soup kitchen, the line already forming outside. "Breakfast," he said simply. Cody swallowed his pride and got in line. Minutes later, a volunteer handed him a tray. Plain oatmeal, a slice of bread, and a cup of weak coffee. He sat at a rickety metal table beside Darnell, trying to ignore the curious glances from the other men around them. "You ain't from here," one of them said, eyeing Cody suspiciously. "Ain't never seen you before." Cody tensed but kept his expression neutral. "New in town," he replied. The man snorted. "Nobody's new here. You either been here, or you ended up here." Darnell waved the man off. "Relax, Pete. Ain't none of us asking for a resume." He turned back to Cody, his expression unreadable. "That being said, you best start learning the rules." Cody swallowed a spoonful of the bland oatmeal. "Rules," Darnell smirked. "First rule, you don't trust nobody too quick. Second rule, you watch where you sleep. Some places you'll wake up missing your shoes. Some places you won't wake up at all." Cody glanced around, noticing how people clutched their belongings close, how some slept sitting up as if afraid to lie down completely. He had read about life on the streets, had seen glimpses of it from his high-rise office window, but experiencing it firsthand was different. Darnell leaned forward. "You want to last out here? You gotta stop looking like someone who don't belong." Cody frowned. "And how do I do that?" Darnell chuckled again, shaking his head. "First, you get yourself dirtier. You smell too clean. Second, you stop walking around like you got a purpose. Nobody out here got a purpose. You want to blend in, you gotta look like you lost everything." Cody stayed quiet. "Third rule," Darnell continued. "If you don't want to get eaten alive, you find a place to sleep before dark. Ain't no mercy out here once the sun goes down." That last rule lingered in Cody's mind. As the day passed, he followed Darnell through the city, observing how he navigated the streets. Darnell knew which corners to avoid, which shops would sometimes give away food instead of throwing it out, and which alleys were claimed by people who wouldn't hesitate to defend their space. By sunset, the city lights flickered to life, and the warmth of the sun faded into a cold, biting breeze. Darnell led Cody toward an abandoned lot, where a few others had already begun setting up for the night. Old blankets, flattened cardboard, whatever insulation they could find. The ground was cold and unforgiving. Cody sat down beside Darnell, shifting uncomfortably. "So what's your story?" he finally asked. Darnell exhaled, rubbing his hands together for warmth. "Used to work construction. Good at it, too. Then a site accident messed up my back. Couldn't work, bills stacked up, and before I knew it, I was out here." His voice was steady, but there was a heaviness beneath his words. One that told Cody this wasn't just some sob story. This was a man who had lived it. Cody stared at the darkening sky. He had spent decades buying and selling properties, reshaping the skyline with projects that had made him millions. But now, sitting in the dirt with a man who had once built those buildings with his bare hands, he felt the weight of his own detachment. This was the world he had ignored. The night grew colder. The sounds of distant sirens and drunken arguments filled the air, but Cody remained still, forcing himself to absorb the reality of his new life. Tomorrow, he would wake up on the ground, aching from the cold. He would have to find food, find warmth, and learn how to survive like the rest of them. But more importantly, he would have to find someone who truly deserved the fortune he could no longer take with him. And so, as Cody lay down on the cold pavement for the first time in his life, he realized one thing. This was only the beginning. The night had been brutal. Cody woke to the stiffness in his limbs, the cold seeping deep into his bones. The thin layer of cardboard beneath him had done little to shield him from the hard ground, and the biting chill of the early morning air made every movement feel sluggish. He wasn't sure how much sleep he had actually gotten, but judging by the dim light creeping through the alley, it hadn't been enough. Darnell was already up, stretching his arms with a practiced ease, as if years of sleeping on pavement had conditioned his body to endure it. "How's your first night on the ground, Cole?" he asked, his voice gruff but laced with amusement. Cody pushed himself up, rubbing the stiffness out of his neck. "Feels like I got hit by a truck," he muttered. Darnell chuckled. "You'll get used to it, or you won't. Either way, the city don't care." He gestured toward the street. "Come on. Morning's the best time to find something decent to eat before the good scraps are gone." Cody followed, adjusting the collar of his jacket against the chill. As they walked, he took in the world around him with a different set of eyes. The city was waking up. Commuters hurried past in pressed suits. Students with backpacks rushed toward buses. Shopkeepers rolled up their metal shutters. None of them spared a glance at the people lining the sidewalks, the ones huddled in corners, invisible to the rest of society. It was a strange feeling, knowing that he had once been on the other side of this divide. He had walked these very streets, taken phone calls worth millions while sipping gourmet coffee, completely blind to the reality beneath him. Darnell led him toward a small diner on the corner of a busy intersection. The smell of bacon and fresh coffee drifted through the air, making Cody's stomach twist with hunger. A group of other homeless men were already gathered outside, watching as an employee emerged from the back door carrying a large plastic bag. Without a word, the bag was set beside the dumpster, and the group pounced. Cody hesitated. Darnell didn't. He moved quickly, digging through the bag with practiced efficiency, pulling out a mostly intact sandwich wrapped in foil. "You gonna eat or just stare?" he asked. Swallowing his pride, Cody stepped forward and reached in. He found a slightly crushed but otherwise edible muffin, its edges stale but still food. The moment he had it in his hand, an older man with sunken cheeks and wild eyes lunged toward him, snatching it from his grasp. "Mine," the man growled, retreating like a wounded animal. Cody's first instinct was to retaliate, but Darnell placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Let it go," he said quietly. Cody clenched his jaw but obeyed. A moment later, Darnell handed him half of his sandwich. Lesson number 4. Some fights ain't worth it. They ate in silence, sitting on the curb as cars rushed past them, the city completely unaware of the small victories and silent struggles taking place in its shadows. As they finished, Darnell wiped his hands on his jacket and exhaled. "Gotta keep moving. Best way to stay out of trouble." Cody nodded, following him once more. But this time, he kept his eyes open, not just to the people around him, but to the lessons unfolding in front of him. Then, the sound of shouting cut through the morning air. Across the street, near an abandoned storefront, a group of young men had gathered in a tight circle. Their voices were loud, aggressive, and in the center of the commotion was a kid, no older than 12, cornered against the wall. Cody's stomach twisted as the scene unfolded. Darnell sighed, already shaking his head. "Stay out of it." But Cody had already started moving. Cody didn't think. He just acted. His body moved before his brain could catch up, instincts overriding logic. The boy was pressed against the brick wall, his small frame trembling as the group of young men loomed over him. One of them, a tall kid with a shaved head and a leather jacket too big for his wiry frame, had his hand clenched tightly around the boy's hoodie, shoving him back every time he tried to inch away. "Just give it up, kid," the leader sneered, his voice laced with irritation. "You really think anyone gives a damn about you?" The boy's lips were pressed into a firm line, his eyes burning with defiance. But Cody could see the fear beneath the tough exterior. He knew that look. He had worn it himself once, a long time ago, when he had been a scrawny kid in a rough neighborhood with no one to back him up. Cody stepped into the street, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. He wasn't sure what his plan was, but backing down wasn't an option. "Hey," Cody called out, his voice firm but controlled. "Let the kid go." The group turned toward him, their expressions shifting from annoyance to amusement. The leader, the one gripping the boy's hoodie, cocked his head. "And who the hell are you, old man?" Old man. The word stung more than Cody cared to admit, but he kept his posture steady. Just someone who doesn't like seeing a bunch of cowards picking on a kid. A murmur of laughter rippled through the group. One of them, a guy with a busted lip and twitchy fingers, nudged the leader. "Yo, this dude crazy or what?" Cody didn't respond. he simply took another step forward, placing himself between them and the boy. His stance was casual, but his gaze was steady, daring them to push their luck. For a tense moment, no one moved. Then, the leader clicked his tongue in irritation and shoved the boy one last time before releasing his grip. "Whatever, man. Kid ain't worth it anyway." The group dispersed, tossing a few final sneers in Cody's direction before disappearing down the alley. Cody let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The boy was still pressed against the wall, his small fists clenched at his sides. Cody turned toward him, crouching slightly to meet his gaze. "You okay?" The boy hesitated before nodding. "Yeah, thanks." Darnell finally approached, shaking his head with a mix of amusement and frustration. "Damn fool," he muttered under his breath. "You trying to get yourself stabbed?" Cody ignored him, focusing on the boy. "What's your name?" The kid hesitated, clearly debating whether or not to trust him. Finally, he muttered, "Gray." Cody felt the name hit him like a gut punch. Gray. It was a name he had never spoken before, but one that had been whispered in his past. A name that belonged to a son he never knew he had. For a moment, Cody couldn't breathe. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossibility in front of him. But the boy, this Gray, was staring at him with wary curiosity, completely unaware of the storm raging inside Cody's head. "You got somewhere to go?" Cody asked, keeping his voice even. Gray shrugged, avoiding his gaze. "I'm fine." Darnell let out a low whistle. "That ain't an answer, kid." Gray tensed, but Cody recognized the walls he was putting up. He had seen it in himself, in the mirror, in every kid who had learned that trusting the wrong person could be dangerous. Cody exhaled, forcing himself to push past the shock. He didn't know if this was his Gray. He didn't even know if he wanted to believe in that kind of coincidence. But one thing was clear. This kid needed help. And Cody wasn't about to walk away. Darnell sighed, glancing between them. "So what now?" Cody didn't hesitate. "Now," he said, "we make sure he's safe." Gray narrowed his eyes. "I don't need saving." Cody met his gaze, and for the first time in years, smiled. "Neither did I. But that didn't stop someone from doing it anyway." The kid didn't respond, but for the briefest moment, something flickered in his expression. Something that told Cody he wasn't as alone as he pretended to be. And just like that, Cody realized his search had already begun. Cody watched as Gray shifted uncomfortably, his small frame still tense from the earlier encounter. The boy glanced toward the alley where the group had disappeared, his fingers twitching as if ready to bolt at any second. Cody had seen that kind of tension before, the kind that came from always being ready to run, from never having a safe place to land. Darnell crossed his arms, letting out a low sigh. "So what's the plan, Cole? You planning on adopting a street kid now?" Cody ignored the sarcasm, keeping his eyes on Gray. "He needs a safe place for the night." Gray scoffed. "I'm fine. I've been fine." Cody didn't miss the way his shoulders tightened as he said it, or the flicker of something vulnerable behind his defiance. He recognized the act, because he had perfected it himself a long time ago. Darnell exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "Ain't no such thing as fine out here, kid. You either got somewhere to go, or you don't." Gray didn't respond. He just shifted his weight, gaze darting to Cody like he was waiting for him to push further. Cody wasn't sure what it was, but there was something about this kid, something that made him feel like walking away wasn't an option. "You got family?" Cody asked. Gray's jaw tightened. "No." The way he said it, clipped and final, told Cody there was more to the story. He didn't press, not yet. Instead, he glanced at Darnell. "Where's the safest place for him to crash tonight?" Darnell let out a short laugh. "Safe? You lost, man? Ain't no safe out here." Cody clenched his jaw. He knew that, but there had to be somewhere better than an alley. Darnell sighed, rubbing a hand over his beard. "Best you got is St. Jude's. They run a shelter out the back of the church, but they don't take in just anybody." Gray immediately shook his head. "Not going to a shelter." Cody studied him. "Why not?" Gray's fingers curled into fists. "Because they ask too many questions." Cody understood. Shelters meant rules. Shelters meant people who might dig too deep, who might separate kids from the only life they knew. If Gray had been on his own long enough, he'd already learned to avoid places that could put him into a system he didn't trust. "All right," Cody said finally. "Then you stay with us tonight." Gray's eyes narrowed. "With you?" Cody nodded. "You don't want a shelter, fine. But you're not spending the night alone." Darnell groaned. "Man, you're collecting strays now? First you, now him? What's next? We start a family out here?" Cody ignored him. His gaze stayed locked on Gray, waiting for the boy's reaction. Gray hesitated, shifting from foot to foot, but eventually gave a small nod. "Fine," Gray muttered, "just for the night." As night fell over New Orleans, Cody, Gray, and Darnell made their way toward an abandoned lot on the outskirts of the city. The ground was uneven, littered with broken glass and discarded debris, but it was better than most places Cody had seen so far. A few other people were already settling in for the night. Some huddled under makeshift tents of tarp and cardboard, others curled up in doorways. No one paid them much attention. Gray stayed close but kept his distance, as if still debating whether he had made the right choice. Cody understood the hesitation. Trust was a rare commodity out here. Darnell sat down against the remains of a crumbling brick wall, letting out a grunt as he stretched his legs. "All right, kid," he said to Gray. "Lesson number 5. Find a spot where you can see trouble before it sees you, and never sleep too deep." Gray nodded, but remained standing. Cody could see the tension in his frame, the way his body was coiled like a spring, ready to bolt. He didn't trust them yet. Maybe he never would. Cody lowered himself onto the cold ground, adjusting his jacket to block out the worst of the night air. His body ached, but it was nothing compared to the discomfort of knowing that this was how so many people lived every day. For a long time, none of them spoke. The city moved around them, cars passing, distant voices echoing from bars and late-night diners. But in their little corner of the world, everything was still. Cody broke the silence. "How long you been out here, Gray?" Gray shifted, his arms crossing over his chest. "Long enough?" Cody nodded, recognizing the non-answer. "Where'd you come from before?" Gray hesitated, his gaze flickering toward Cody before settling on a spot in the distance. A place that wasn't any better than this. Cody didn't push further, though every instinct in him wanted to. Instead, he said, "Well, you got a place to crash tonight. That's a start." Gray scoffed, kicking out a loose rock. "And then what? You gonna try to fix my life?" Cody exhaled, looking up at the night sky. "Number just making sure you get through another day." Gray studied him for a moment before finally sitting down, though he kept a good foot of space between them. It wasn't much, but it was something. Darnell let out a snort. "You two gonna bond all night, or we actually getting some sleep?" Cody smirked, but didn't respond. He leaned back against the wall, letting exhaustion pull at his limbs. For the first time in years, he had no walls, no security, no control over what came next. And yet, as he glanced at the kid beside him, he felt something unexpected. Purpose. Gray wasn't just another face in the crowd. He wasn't just some street kid fighting to survive. Cody had no proof, but in his gut he knew. Somehow, some way, this boy was his son. He closed his eyes, but sleep didn't come easy. Because now, more than ever, Cody knew that his time was running out. And before it did, he had to make sure Gray got the life he deserved. Cody woke before the sun, his body stiff and aching from another night on the cold pavement. He had never been a light sleeper before, but out here, instincts kept him alert, pulling him from sleep at every distant siren or shifting shadow. He sat up slowly, his muscles protesting the movement. Beside him, Gray was still curled up, his small frame wrapped in an oversized hoodie, his breathing steady but shallow. Darnell was already awake, watching the street as he sipped from a dented thermos. He nodded toward Cody. "You snore," he muttered. Cody smirked, rolling his shoulders to ease the stiffness. "You sure that wasn't you?" Darnell chuckled, taking another sip before glancing at Gray. "Kid still asleep?" "For now," Cody said, lowering his voice. He took a moment to study the boy's face in the dim morning light. Even in sleep, Gray's expression was tight, like he was bracing for something. A kid that age shouldn't look like that. Darnell shifted, adjusting his position against the wall. "You really gonna keep an eye on him?" Cody didn't hesitate. "Yeah." Darnell sighed, shaking his head. "Man, you don't know what you're getting into. These kids, they don't trust easy, and they sure as hell don't stick around when things get messy." Cody exhaled. He knew Darnell was right. Gray had spent too much time alone, too much time learning not to rely on anyone. But Cody also knew something else. He couldn't walk away. Before he could respond, Gray stirred. His eyes flickered open, immediately darting to Cody and Darnell, as if assessing whether they were still there. He sat up, rubbing the sleep from his face. "What time is it?" Cody glanced at the sky, where hints of orange were creeping over the horizon. "Early." Gray pulled his hood up, tucking his hands into his sleeves. "I gotta go." Cody frowned. "Go where?" "Does it matter?" Gray muttered, avoiding his gaze. Cody didn't push, but something about the way Gray's shoulders tensed told him this wasn't just aimless wandering. He had somewhere he needed to be. Darnell stretched and stood. "Well, wherever you're headed, don't get caught up in any more trouble. We got lucky yesterday." Gray smirked. "I don't get caught." Cody exchanged a glance with Darnell before standing as well. "I'll walk with you." Gray's smirk faded. "I don't need a babysitter." "Not a babysitter," Cody said simply. "Just company." Gray hesitated, then shrugged. "Whatever. Just don't slow me down." They left the alley, stepping onto the crowded sidewalks as the city fully came to life. Cody followed a few steps behind, watching as Gray weaved through the streets with ease, his movements calculated, precise. This kid knew how to survive, which only made Cody wonder what had forced him to learn. Gray led them through the bustling streets with a confidence that only came from experience. He moved like he belonged there, like he knew every shortcut, every alley, every place where a kid like him could disappear if he needed to. Cody followed, staying a few steps behind, letting the boy set the pace. He wasn't here to interrogate or smother him. He just needed to understand. After several blocks, Gray suddenly turned down a narrow alley lined with dumpsters and graffiti-streaked walls. Cody hesitated, glancing at the boarded-up doors and scattered debris. This wasn't just a shortcut. This was a destination. Gray stopped near a metal side door, knocking twice in a deliberate pattern. Cody's stomach tightened as the door creaked open, revealing a woman in her late 30s, her expression wary and tired. She wore a faded hoodie and had sharp eyes that flickered between Gray and Cody with immediate suspicion. "Gray," she said slowly. "Who's this?" Gray shrugged. "Just some guy." Cody bit back a smirk. "So that's all I am now." He extended a hand. "Cole." The woman didn't take it. "Uh-huh." She turned back to Gray. "You shouldn't be bringing strangers here." Gray rolled his eyes. "He's fine, Liz." Liz exhaled sharply, stepping back to let Gray inside. Cody hesitated in the doorway, his gut telling him that this place, wherever it was, meant something to Gray. "Don't just stand there," Liz said, her voice edged with impatience. "Come in or don't, but close the damn door." Cody stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and damp wood. The room was dimly lit, cluttered with mismatched chairs and old couches. A few other kids, teenagers mostly, sat huddled in corners, talking in low voices. A shelter? No, it was too informal for that. A hideout, a place for kids who had nowhere else to go. Gray dropped onto a couch, slouching like he had been here 100 times before. Liz crossed her arms, still watching Cody like he was a threat. "So, Cole, what's your deal?" Cody met her gaze evenly. "Just keeping an eye on Gray." Liz scoffed. "Yeah? And why's that?" Cody didn't answer right away. He couldn't exactly tell her the truth, that he had a gut feeling this boy might be his son, that every instinct in him was screaming not to walk away. Instead, he said, "Because someone should." Liz's expression softened, just a little. "Well, you're late to the party. Kid's been looking out for himself a long time." Cody didn't doubt that. Liz sighed, rubbing her temples. "Look, I don't know who you are or why you care, but Gray's not a charity case. He comes and goes as he pleases, just like the rest of them." Cody glanced around at the other kids. Too thin, too tired, too young to have eyes that empty. "I'm not here to save him," Cody said quietly. "I just want to make sure he doesn't disappear." Liz studied him for a long moment, then finally relented. "Fine, but don't get in the way." She walked off, leaving Cody standing there while Gray pretended not to be listening. Cody sat down across from him, stretching out his legs. "So, this is where you go?" Gray shrugged. "Sometimes." Cody nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of that single word. Sometimes meant there was no permanent home. Sometimes meant he was always looking for somewhere better, even if he never found it. Cody exhaled, feeling something tighten in his chest. He had started this journey looking for someone to inherit his fortune. Now he wasn't sure if he wanted to give Gray his money, or something much more valuable. Gray moved through the city streets with the ease of someone who had long since learned to blend in. His pace quick but unhurried, his eyes constantly scanning. Cody kept up, staying a few steps behind, watching how the kid navigated through alleyways and side streets, slipping past crowds without drawing attention. It was a skill Cody recognized, the ability to move unseen, to avoid becoming a target. After about 20 minutes of walking, Gray finally stopped in front of a run-down convenience store on the edge of a neighborhood that had seen better days. The building's neon sign flickered, and the windows were covered in old flyers and peeling advertisements. Cody could see a security camera barely hanging from a bent bracket above the door, pointing more toward the ground than anything useful. Gray turned to Cody, his expression unreadable. "You really don't gotta follow me." Cody crossed his arms. "And yet, here I am." Gray exhaled through his nose, clearly irritated but not enough to start an argument. Instead, he pushed open the door and stepped inside. Cody followed, immediately hit by the stale air and the scent of cheap detergent mixed with something greasy. The store was small, dimly lit, with shelves that looked like they hadn't been properly stocked in weeks. A bored-looking cashier sat behind the counter, flipping through a magazine, barely glancing up as they entered. Gray walked straight toward the back, where a cooler hummed loudly, stocked with bottled water and soft drinks. He grabbed 2 bottles and a pack of crackers from a half-empty shelf, then made his way to the counter. Cody observed quietly, noting how Gray kept his posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp, as if expecting trouble. When Gray placed the items on the counter, the cashier finally looked up. He was in his 40s, balding, wearing a stained polo shirt that barely fit over his round belly. His eyes narrowed slightly as he scanned Gray, his lip curling in mild annoyance. "That all?" the cashier asked, his voice indifferent. Gray nodded, pulling a few crumpled bills from his pocket and placing them on the counter. Cody immediately noticed that the kid was a few dollars short. The cashier glanced at the money, then back at Gray. "Not enough." Gray's jaw tightened. "Come on, man. I come here all the time." The cashier sighed heavily, scratching at the stubble on his chin. "And every time, you try to pull this." He leaned forward slightly. "We ain't running a charity, kid." Gray's hand clenched into a fist. Cody could see the frustration flickering in his eyes, the fight-or-flight instinct kicking in. He'd been here before, relying on whatever scraps he could pull together, hoping someone would let a few dollars slide. Cody stepped forward, placing a $5 bill on the counter without a word. Gray stiffened, his face flushing with something that wasn't quite embarrassment, but close. He didn't turn to look at Cody, just grabbed the bag as soon as the cashier pushed it toward him and walked out. Cody followed. Outside, Gray spun around, his expression tight. "I didn't ask you to do that." Cody shrugged. "I know." Gray shook his head, shoving the bag under his arm. "You keep doing stuff like that, people are going to think I can't take care of myself." Cody studied him for a moment, then said, "I don't think that. I think you've been taking care of yourself for too long." Gray's eyes flickered with something Cody couldn't quite name before he looked away, muttering under his breath, "Whatever." Cody let the silence stretch between them for a moment before finally asking, "Where are we going next?" Gray hesitated. Then, after a beat, he said, "There's someone I need to check on." Cody nodded, falling into step beside him once again. Gray led Cody through a maze of back alleys and side streets, his steps deliberate but unhurried. Cody recognized the route, not in the sense that he had walked it before, but in the way it felt like a path well worn by someone who had traveled it countless times. Gray wasn't just wandering, he had a destination. They passed a row of old apartment buildings, their paint peeling, fire escapes rusting from years of neglect. The neighborhood had a heaviness to it, the kind of place where people had long since stopped expecting things to get better. Cody had owned buildings like these before, had flipped properties in places just like this, never stopping to think about the people who had been forced out when the rent went up. Now, walking these streets as a different man, he saw them in a way he never had before. Finally, Gray stopped in front of a narrow alley tucked between 2 buildings. The space was barely wide enough for a person to walk through without brushing against the damp brick walls. Cody peered inside but saw nothing but shadows. Gray hesitated, shifting his weight. "Stay here." Cody frowned. "Not happening." Gray sighed but didn't argue. Instead, he stepped into the alley, moving carefully, his shoulders tense like he was expecting something to go wrong. Cody followed, staying a few steps behind. The alley opened up into a small enclosed space behind the buildings. There, huddled against the wall, was a girl, no older than Gray, wrapped in a dirty blanket, her arms clutching a plastic bag full of what looked like clothes. She had dark hair, tangled and messy, and her face was pale under the dim light filtering in from a street lamp above. Gray crouched beside her. "Elena." Cody's breath caught in his throat. The girl stirred, blinking up at Gray with groggy confusion. Then, recognition flickered across her face, and she sat up straighter. "Gray?" Her voice was hoarse, like she hadn't spoken in hours. Gray reached into the bag he had carried from the store, pulling out the bottle of water and the crackers. "Here." Elena hesitated, then grabbed the water first, twisting off the cap with shaking hands. She took a few small sips before exhaling, closing her eyes like she was savoring it. Then, she opened the crackers and nibbled at one, chewing slowly. Cody stayed back, watching. His mind was racing, piecing things together even before Gray spoke again. "You okay?" Gray asked quietly. Elena nodded, but the way she held herself said otherwise. She looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept in days. Cody finally stepped forward, clearing his throat. "She's been out here alone?" Gray tensed, shooting him a look, but Elena barely reacted. She glanced at Cody, studying him with wary eyes. "I've been fine," she muttered. Gray scoffed. "No, you haven't." Elena's grip tightened around the plastic bag in her lap. "I couldn't go back." Cody frowned. "Go back where?" Elena didn't answer. Gray looked away, jaw tight. "It doesn't matter." But it did. Cody knew it. He didn't push. Not yet. But the realization settled heavy in his chest. This wasn't just any girl. This was Elena White, the daughter he had never known. And just like that, everything changed. Cody stood frozen, his mind racing as he looked at the girl huddled against the wall. Elena. The name alone was enough to make his pulse hammer against his ribs. He had barely begun to process the idea that Gray might be his son. And now, right in front of him, was another piece of the puzzle he hadn't even known was missing. Gray sat next to her, his body angled protectively, as if shielding her from a threat Cody couldn't see. "How long have you been out here?" Gray asked, his voice quieter now, the usual sharpness dulled by something Cody could only describe as worry. Elena shrugged, picking at the plastic wrapping of the crackers. "Few days." "Alone?" She nodded. Gray exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "Damn it, Elena." Cody watched the exchange in silence, his stomach twisting. There was history between them, a connection that ran deeper than simple friendship. It wasn't just that Gray had found her. He had been looking for her. Elena shifted under the weight of their stares, pulling her knees up to her chest. "I couldn't stay," she muttered. Cody finally spoke. "Stay where?" Elena's gaze flicked toward him, sharp and assessing, as if she were trying to decide how much she could trust him. He recognized the look. He had seen it in Gray, in Darnell, in himself. After a long pause, she said, "With them." Cody frowned. "Who's them?" Gray answered for her. "Her foster family." Cody inhaled slowly, trying to keep his expression neutral, but inside, He felt the weight of the situation shift again. Foster care. That meant she hadn't just run away from home. She had run away from people who were supposed to take care of her. Elena picked at a loose thread on her sleeve. It wasn't safe. Gray's jaw clenched. They hurt you? Elena didn't answer right away, but the silence was answer enough. Cody took a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm. Why didn't you tell someone? Elena let out a dry laugh, bitter and hollow. Tell who? Social workers? The cops? They don't care. I'm just another kid in the system. Cody could see it in her face. The exhaustion, the resignation. She had learned early what it meant to be abandoned, to be just another case file shuffled between hands. Gray's hands curled into fists. I told you if something happened, you were supposed to call me. Elena shook her head. And then what? You're barely getting by yourself. What were you going to do, Gray? Fix it? Gray didn't answer. Cody watched them, their unspoken conversation hanging heavy in the air. They weren't just friends. They were family, and they had both been left behind. He exhaled. All right, he said finally. She's not staying out here. Gray's head snapped up. And where's she supposed to go? Cody met his gaze. With us. Gray scoffed. Us? Since when is there an us? Cody didn't flinch. Since now. Gray shook his head, letting out a short, humorless laugh. Man, you don't even know her. Cody didn't waver. His voice was calm but firm. Maybe not. But I know she can't stay here. Elena's eyes flicked between them, her posture tense. She looked like she wanted to argue, to fight back. But there was something else, too. Something Cody recognized. It was exhaustion. The kind that settled in deep. The kind that came from running too long with nowhere left to go. She pulled her knees tighter to her chest. I don't need your help, she muttered. Cody crouched down so he was at her level, resting his arms on his knees. Yeah? And how long do you think you'll last out here alone? She didn't answer. Gray was still tense, his jaw clenched, but Cody could see the hesitation in his eyes. He didn't trust easily, neither of them did, but they were running out of options. Finally, Gray let out a sharp breath. If she comes with us, we don't take her to a shelter. Cody nodded. Agreed. Elena frowned. Then where? A safe place. Cody cut in before she could object. He wasn't sure what that meant yet, but he knew one thing. He wasn't leaving her out here. Darnell, who had been silent until now, let out a deep sigh. You two sure do collect trouble. Cody smirked. Guess you're stuck with us. Darnell shook his head, but didn't argue. All right, but if we're taking her, we move now, before the wrong people start asking questions. Cody nodded, helping Elena to her feet. She was lighter than she should have been, her limbs too thin, like she hadn't had a real meal in weeks. Gray stepped beside her, his expression unreadable. You good? Elena shrugged. I've been worse. Cody studied the two of them. Two kids forced to grow up too fast, to fend for themselves in a world that had never cared enough to protect them. He wasn't sure what came next, but he knew one thing for certain. They weren't alone anymore. They started walking, the city stretching out before them, full of unknowns, but for the first time in a long time, Cody didn't feel like he was wandering aimlessly. He had a purpose, and he wasn't letting them go. The streets were quieter now, the city shifting into the late hours of the night. Cody, Gray, Elena, and Darnell moved through the alleyways, staying in the shadows, avoiding the places where people might ask too many questions. Cody knew they needed to find a place for Elena to rest, somewhere safer than a back alley or an abandoned lot. The girl was running on empty, her steps slowing, her thin frame barely holding itself together. Gray walked beside her, glancing at her every few moments, as if making sure she was still there. Cody noticed the way Elena kept one hand clutching the strap of her bag, like it was the only thing tethering her to something solid. Whatever she had inside, it wasn't just clothes. Darnell led them down a side street, toward a neighborhood where the buildings were old but still standing, the kind of place where people kept to themselves and didn't ask too many questions. He stopped in front of a narrow brick building with a metal gate in front of the door. A faded sign above it read, "Stella's Diner." "Here?" Cody asked, raising a brow. Darnell gave a small nod. "Owner's a friend. Used to help me out when I had nowhere else to go. She's got a storeroom in the back. Ain't fancy, but it's warm, and it locks from the inside." Cody hesitated. He wasn't used to relying on the kindness of strangers, but he wasn't doing this for himself. He looked at Elena, who was swaying slightly on her feet, her exhaustion barely masked by her stubborn pride. "All right," Cody said. "Let's try." Darnell rapped his knuckles on the door, 3 sharp knocks, then 2 softer ones. A few seconds passed before a light flickered on behind the glass panel, followed by the sound of metal locks clicking. The door opened slightly, revealing an older woman with dark eyes and sharp cheekbones. She studied them through the crack before exhaling. "Darnell," she muttered. "What the hell have you dragged in this time?" Darnell grinned. "A couple of lost souls, Stella. Think you got a little room left?" Stella sighed, stepping back and pulling the door open. "Get inside before someone sees you." Cody ushered Gray and Elena in first, following close behind. The warmth of the diner hit them immediately. The smell of old grease and coffee, the soft hum of a refrigerator in the back. The place was empty, the chairs stacked on the tables, the floor freshly mopped. Stella locked the door behind them, crossing her arms. "You know I don't run a damn shelter, Darnell." "I know," Darnell said. "Just need a place for the girl. 1 night, maybe 2. Stella's eyes moved to Elena, who stood with her shoulders hunched, wary but too exhausted to argue. Stella sighed again, rubbing a hand over her face. "Jesus. Fine. But if anyone asks, I didn't see you." She turned, motioning for them to follow. "Come on, storage room's in the back." Cody exhaled, tension easing slightly. They had a place. For now. But he knew this was just the beginning. Stella led them through the narrow hallway at the back of the diner, past the kitchen where the lingering scent of fried food clung to the air. The storage room was small, cluttered with boxes of canned goods and bags of flour stacked against the walls. A metal shelf lined with condiments and paper supplies took up most of the space, but in the far corner was a folded cot, covered with a thin blanket. It wasn't much, but it was warm, safe, and out of sight. Elena stood in the doorway, eyeing the space like she wasn't sure if she should step inside. Gray nudged her lightly. "It's better than the alley." She let out a breath, nodded, and finally stepped forward, dropping her bag onto the cot before sitting down. She was exhausted, but Cody could see the way her fingers still gripped the fabric of her hoodie, like she was preparing for someone to tell her to leave at any second. Stella crossed her arms. "She eats before she sleeps." Elena looked up, startled. "What?" Stella motioned toward the kitchen. "I didn't say you could stay just to pass out in here. You eat first." Elena hesitated, but when Stella turned and walked back toward the kitchen, she slowly got up and followed. Cody exchanged a glance with Darnell, who smirked. "Told you, She's rough, but she's got a heart. Gray sighed and leaned against the doorframe. She better not make me eat too. Darnell chuckled. Oh, kid, if Stella decides you're hungry, you don't got a choice. Cody didn't smile. He was watching Elena, watching how she moved, how she hesitated before taking what was given to her. She had spent too long learning not to rely on anyone. After a few minutes, Stella handed Elena a plate with a grilled cheese sandwich and a small bowl of soup. The girl took it carefully, sitting at the empty counter and eating slowly, like she wasn't sure if the meal would be taken from her if she finished too fast. Gray sat beside her, nudging his plate away when Stella set one down in front of him. I'm not... Stella shot him a look. You're not an idiot, so don't act like one. Eat. Gray sighed but picked up the sandwich. Cody leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. He had never thought about how simple things, a meal, a warm room, a locked door, could mean so much when they weren't guaranteed. Stella wiped her hands on a dish towel and turned toward him. What's your deal? Cody met her gaze. Just passing through, she scoffed. Yeah, and I'm the Queen of England. Darnell grinned. Told you he was weird. Stella eyed Cody for a moment longer before shaking her head. I don't know what kind of mess you're in, but don't bring it to my door. Cody nodded. Understood. Stella sighed and looked at Elena. Kid stays, couple of days, no more. Cody exhaled. That's all we need. For now. Elena finished her meal, her eyelids drooping from exhaustion. Stella motioned toward the storage room. Go on, get some sleep. Elena hesitated, then stood and made her way back, Gray following close behind. Cody watched them disappear into the room before turning to Stella. Thank you. Stella waved him off. Don't thank me. Just don't make me regret it. Cody nodded, but deep down, he already knew this wouldn't be that simple. Because now that they had found Elena, things were about to get even more complicated. Cody sat in the dimly lit diner, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound filling the silence. Darnell had already dozed off in a chair near the back, arms crossed, breathing slow and steady. Gray and Elena were in the storage room, the door slightly ajar. Cody had peeked in once to see them curled up in opposite corners, too tired to talk, but not yet comfortable enough to let their guard down completely. He hadn't slept. His body was exhausted, but his mind wouldn't stop. There were too many questions, too many things that didn't make sense. Elena was in the foster system. Gray had known about her. But how? How long had he been searching? Why had she run away? And why, after all these years, had Cody found them both at the same time? The pieces didn't fit, but one thing was clear. He had to find out the truth. A creak from the storage room made him look up. Elena stepped out, barefoot, her hoodie pulled tight around her small frame. She looked smaller than before, her exhaustion making her seem younger than she was. She hesitated when she saw Cody sitting there. Couldn't sleep? He asked. She shrugged. Too quiet. Cody smirked. Darnell snores. Elena huffed a quiet laugh and sat down across from him at the counter. She pulled her knees up, resting her chin on them. Her eyes flickered to the door, then back to Cody. Are you Gray's friend? The question caught him off guard. He wasn't sure how to answer. Something like that, he said. Elena tilted her head slightly, studying him. You don't look like you belong here. Cody let out a slow breath. You don't either. Elena looked away, her fingers curling around the fabric of her hoodie. I used to, she murmured. Cody leaned forward slightly. What happened? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached into the small bag she had carried with her since they found her and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She smoothed it out on the counter before sliding it toward him. Cody hesitated before picking it up. The paper was old, slightly crumpled, but the writing was neat. It was a case report, a summary from the foster system. At the top, bold letters made his stomach drop. Name: Elena White. Status: foster placement. Approved. Biological family: Evelyn Carter. Mother: unknown father. His heart pounded. The name jumped off the page like a gunshot. Evelyn, he swallowed, his throat dry. Where did you get this? Elena shrugged, but there was something guarded in her expression. It was in my foster file. I took it before I left. Cody read the paper again, his grip tightening slightly. Evelyn Carter. He knew that name. And suddenly everything made sense. Elena was his daughter. Cody felt his pulse hammer against his ribs as he read the paper again, his mind struggling to process the truth staring back at him. Evelyn Carter. He hadn't heard that name in over a decade, but it had been burned into his memory. The only woman he had ever truly loved, and the one who had left without a word. He looked up at Elena, who was watching him carefully, as if waiting for him to react. She had no idea what she had just handed him. No idea that the man sitting across from her wasn't just some drifter Gray had picked up. He was her father. His stomach twisted. He wanted to tell her, to say something, but the words lodged in his throat. How long have you had this? He asked instead, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. Elena shrugged. A while. She pulled her knees tighter to her chest. Didn't really mean anything to me. Just a name. Cody clenched his jaw. To her, he had been nothing but a name on a piece of paper. He forced himself to focus. There would be time for emotions later. Right now, he needed answers. What happened with your foster family? He asked, keeping his voice gentle. Elena hesitated, picking at a loose thread on her hoodie. They weren't bad at first, she admitted, but after a while it changed. They stopped caring, stopped even pretending to. Cody felt his hands tighten into fists under the counter. He had heard stories like this before. Kids shuffled through the system, placed with families who only saw them as a check from the state. Did they hurt you? His voice was controlled, but he felt the anger simmering beneath his skin. Elena's expression darkened, but she didn't answer. That was enough. Cody exhaled slowly, trying to keep himself from reacting too strongly. He couldn't afford to scare her off. Not now. Not when he was so close to figuring out the truth. What about your mom? He asked carefully. Do you remember her? Elena frowned, shaking her head. Not really. Just bits and pieces. I remember her reading to me when I was little. She used to sing sometimes. Her voice softened, like she was reaching for a memory she couldn't quite grasp. But she's been gone a long time. Cody swallowed the lump in his throat. Evelyn had raised Elena, for a while at least. But something had happened. Something had taken her away from their daughter. He needed to know why. Before he could ask more, the door to the storage room creaked open, and Gray stepped out, rubbing his eyes. He frowned when he saw them sitting together. What's going on? Elena quickly folded the paper and shoved it back into her bag. Nothing, she said, her voice clipped. Gray's eyes flicked between them, but he didn't push. Instead, he ran a hand through his hair. We should go soon. Can't stay here forever. Cody nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He had come here looking for someone to leave his fortune to. Instead, He had found his children. And now, more than ever, he needed to find Evelyn. Because if she was still out there, she had a lot of explaining to do. Cody barely slept. The knowledge that Elena was his daughter had shaken him more than anything else since he'd left behind his old life. He had spent years believing he had no family, no legacy to leave behind. And now, in the span of days, he had found not just one, but two children who had never known he existed. It should have felt like fate, like some grand design meant to bring him full circle. Instead, it felt like a cruel joke. Evelyn had never told him. He had spent years convincing himself that she had left because she hadn't loved him enough to stay. But now, he had to ask himself the question he had avoided for so long. Had she left to protect their children? The thought made his stomach twist. By the time the sun rose, Cody had made up his mind. He needed to find Evelyn. Whatever had happened in the past, whatever reasons she had for keeping this from him, he needed answers. More importantly, Gray and Elena deserved answers. He glanced at them now, still curled up in the storage room, their breathing slow and steady. Two kids who had been forced to survive on their own for far too long. He wasn't going to let that happen anymore. Darnell stirred from his spot near the front of the diner, rubbing his face before glancing at Cody. "You look like hell," he muttered. Cody smirked. "Feels about right." Darnell stretched, letting out a grunt. "What's the plan?" Cody exhaled. "I need to find Evelyn." Darnell raised a brow. "The mother?" Cody nodded. "She's the only one who can tell me the full truth. I don't know why she left. I don't know why she put Elena in the system, but I need to find out." Darnell rubbed his chin, considering. "You got any leads?" Cody thought for a moment, then nodded. "If she's still using her real name, I can track her down." He glanced at Darnell. "You still got that guy who works at the library? The one who knows how to dig up information?" Darnell smirked. "Eddie? Yeah, he owes me a favor." "Good," Cody said, "because I need to find her before it's too late." Darnell tilted his head. "Too late for what?" Cody hesitated. He hadn't told anyone about his heart condition, hadn't let them know that his time was running out. But if he was going to do this right, if he was going to make sure Gray and Elena had a future, he couldn't waste time. He looked at Darnell and finally admitted, "I don't have much time left." Darnell frowned, processing his words. "What do you mean?" Cody sighed. "I'm sick. Heart condition. Doctors gave me months, maybe less." Darnell let out a low whistle, shaking his head. "Damn, man." He rubbed a hand over his face. "And you're out here playing guardian angel?" Cody smirked, though there was no humor in it. "Something like that." Darnell was quiet for a moment before nodding. "All right. Let's go find your missing woman." Cody glanced back at the storage room, where Gray and Elena were still asleep. He knew they wouldn't like it if he left, but this was something he had to do. Because if Evelyn was still out there, she had to know that their kids weren't alone anymore. Cody and Darnell moved through the quiet streets of New Orleans as the city slowly came to life. The early morning air was cool, laced with the scent of fresh bread from a nearby bakery and the dampness left behind by last night's rain. Cody's mind was racing, his body moving on autopilot as they made their way toward the public library. Eddie worked the tech desk there, a guy Darnell had once described as a genius stuck in the wrong life. Cody had never met him, but if Darnell vouched for him, that was enough. The library was mostly empty this early. Just a few students and an older man hunched over a newspaper in the corner. Eddie sat behind a cluttered desk in the farthest corner of the room, his fingers flying across the keyboard, typing at a speed that made Cody's head hurt just watching. Darnell walked up first, tapping twice on the counter. Eddie. Eddie didn't look up. You again? Darnell grinned. Told you I'd be back. Eddie sighed, finally glancing up, pushing his thick glasses higher on his nose. He looked exactly like the kind of guy who spent too much time behind a screen. Thin, pale, dark circles under his eyes. He looked at Cody, then back at Darnell. Who's your friend? Darnell jerked a thumb at Cody. This is Cole. He needs a favor. Eddie exhaled sharply. Of course he does. He leaned back in his chair, cracking his knuckles. All right, let's hear it. Cody placed his hands on the counter, meeting Eddie's gaze. I need to find someone. Her name is Evelyn Carter. Eddie blinked. You're joking, right? Cody frowned. Do I look like I'm joking? Eddie let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. Evelyn Carter isn't exactly an easy name to track. You got any more details? Cody hesitated, then said, She lived in New Orleans about 12 years ago. Had a daughter named Elena White. Might have changed her name, but I need to know where she went. Eddie sighed but nodded. All right, give me a sec. His fingers flew across the keyboard, lines of data scrolling across the screen as he worked. Cody watched, his stomach twisting. If Evelyn was still in New Orleans, this was his best shot at finding her. After a few minutes, Eddie let out a low whistle. Well, well. Looks like your girl's been keeping a low profile. Cody leaned in. What do you mean? Eddie clicked a few more times, then turned the screen slightly toward them. She disappeared off the grid about 10 years ago. No credit cards, no registered address, no phone records. Last known employment was at a diner in Baton Rouge. After that, nothing. Cody clenched his jaw. She had erased herself. Darnell exhaled. Damn, she really didn't want to be found. Cody stared at the screen, his mind racing. Why had she disappeared? What had forced her to erase her life while leaving Elena behind? Eddie frowned, clicking on another tab. Wait a minute. Cody's breath hitched. What? Eddie narrowed his eyes at the screen. I might have something. There's a recent hospital record from last year. Name's different, Eve Langley, but the birth date matches Evelyn Carter. Cody's chest tightened. What kind of hospital record? Eddie hesitated. She was admitted for complications from a serious illness, but the record doesn't say if she was discharged. Cody felt like the air had been sucked from the room. Darnell shifted beside him. Man, what if she's... Cody cut him off. I need to go there. His voice was steady, but inside he felt like he was unraveling. Eddie gave him a long look before nodding. I'll send you the address. Cody forced himself to breathe. He had come looking for answers. Now he was afraid of what he might find. Cody and Darnell made their way through the city streets, moving with purpose. The early morning air was crisp, the sidewalk still damp from the night's rain. Cody's mind raced as they walked, every step bringing him closer to a confrontation he wasn't sure he was ready for. Evelyn Carter, the woman he had spent years trying to forget. The woman who had given him 2 children without him ever knowing. Darnell led the way toward the public library, where Eddie, a former hacker turned street informant, spent most of his time. They entered the building, the musty scent of old books filling the air. Eddie was exactly where Darnell had said he'd be, sitting at a corner desk with an ancient-looking laptop, his fingers tapping away at the keyboard. Eddie glanced up when he saw them approaching, raising an eyebrow. Darnell, haven't seen you in a while. You need another fake ID? Darnell smirked. Not today, man. We need information. Eddie leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. Depends on what kind. Cody stepped forward. I need to find someone. A woman named Evelyn Carter. Eddie's expression shifted slightly. That's a common name. She would be in her early 40s now, Cody said. And she had a daughter, Elena White. Might have changed her name. Eddie studied Cody for a moment before exhaling. All right, give me a sec. He turned back to his laptop, his fingers flying over the keys as he searched through databases Cody didn't even want to know how he had access to. Minutes passed in silence. Cody felt his heartbeat quicken as he waited. This was it, the moment that would determine if he had a chance to fix what had been broken, or if he had already lost too much time. Finally, Eddie let out a low whistle. Well, well, you're in luck. He turned the screen toward Cody. Looks like Evelyn Carter is still in New Orleans, works at a community clinic on the west side. Been there for a few years. Goes by Evelyn Hayes now. Cody's breath caught. She was here. All this time she had been in the same city, just a few miles away. Darnell glanced at him. You good? Cody nodded slowly. Yeah, let's go. Eddie smirked. Careful, man. Some ghosts don't like being found. Cody didn't respond. He was already heading for the door, his mind set. He was going to see Evelyn, and this time, he wasn't leaving without answers. The clinic was tucked between a laundromat and a rundown apartment complex, its exterior plain but clean. The glass door marked with faded letters that read, Hayes Family Health Center. Cody stood across the street, staring at the building, his pulse pounding in his ears. She had been here for years, right under his nose. He had spent so much time thinking she had disappeared off the face of the earth. Yet here she was, in the same city, living a completely different life. He wasn't sure how to feel about that. Darnell, standing beside him, exhaled. You sure about this? Cody clenched his jaw. I have to be. Without another word, he crossed the street and pushed open the glass door. The waiting area was small but well kept, the walls lined with pamphlets on affordable health care and community programs. A young receptionist glanced up from behind the desk, her expression polite but tired. Can I help you? Cody hesitated for only a second. I'm looking for Evelyn Hayes. The receptionist nodded toward the back. She's in the exam rooms. Give me a moment. Cody's fingers curled at his sides as she disappeared through a hallway. A part of him wanted to turn around, to walk away before he could face the past, before he could face her. But he had spent too much of his life running. This time, he was going to stand his ground. A minute later, the receptionist returned. She'll be right out. Cody nodded but didn't move. His heartbeat was erratic now, a mix of nerves and something else, something like anger. Not just at Evelyn, but at himself, for not looking harder, for not knowing sooner. Then, the door to the back opened, and there she was. Evelyn Carter, or Evelyn Hayes now, stepped out into the waiting room, her dark hair pulled back into a loose ponytail, her white coat slightly wrinkled from a long shift. The moment her eyes landed on him, she froze. Cody saw the flicker of shock in her gaze, followed by something deeper. Guilt. Cody? Her voice was barely above a whisper. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to keep his expression neutral. Hello, Evelyn. For a moment, neither of them moved. The air between them was thick, years of unspoken words pressing down like a weight neither of them knew how to lift. Finally, Evelyn exhaled, composing herself. What are you doing here? Cody let out a short, humorless chuckle. That's a hell of a question coming from you. Evelyn winced, her eyes darting toward the receptionist, then back to him. Come with me, she said quickly, leading him toward a private office. He followed without hesitation, his mind already racing with everything he wanted to say. The moment the door shut behind them, Evelyn turned, crossing her arms. "How did you find me?" Cody met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "I didn't. I found them." Evelyn's face went pale. "Them?" "Elena. Gray." The breath she had been holding escaped in a sharp exhale. She stumbled back slightly, gripping the edge of the desk behind her, as if the weight of his words had physically knocked the air out of her. "You found them?" she whispered. Cody nodded slowly, his voice steady but edged with something dangerous. "They were living on the streets, Evelyn, alone." Evelyn shook her head, eyes wide, her hands trembling. No, that's not possible. Elena was with a foster family. She was supposed to be safe." Cody clenched his jaw. "Safe? She ran away. And Gray's been out there on his own for who knows how long. You tell me, Evelyn, how the hell was any of this supposed to be safe?" Her eyes filled with something he hadn't expected. Tears. She covered her mouth with her hand, inhaling shakily. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I swear to God, Cody, I didn't know." Cody exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. He had come here angry, ready for a confrontation, but now seeing her break down, the anger started to slip away, replaced by something else, a desperate need to understand. "Then tell me," he said, his voice softer now. "Tell me what happened." Evelyn wiped at her eyes, taking a shaky breath. "I tried to find you. After I found out I was pregnant, I tried. But you were gone, Cody. You had left. No one would tell me where you were. I had nothing. And then I got sick." She swallowed hard. "I had complications after giving birth. I barely made it through. And by the time I was stable again, I couldn't take care of both of them. I had no money, no support. I thought giving Elena up for adoption was the only way to keep her safe." Cody closed his eyes briefly, the weight of her words settling over him. He had spent so many years resenting her, believing she had left by choice. But now, hearing her say it, he realized something else. She had been just as lost as he had. "And Gray?" he asked. Evelyn exhaled. "I kept him as long as I could. But when he was 4, I got sick again. The medical bills, everything, I lost him. The state took him, put him in the system. I fought, Cody. I fought like hell. But I wasn't stable enough. I didn't have the resources. And by the time I was back on my feet, he was gone." Her voice broke. "I never stopped looking for them." Cody stared at her, his chest tightening. He had come here expecting betrayal. Instead, he had found a mother who had lost everything. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then Evelyn whispered, "Where are they now?" Cody inhaled deeply. "With me." Her eyes widened, hope flickering across her face. "Can I see them?" Cody hesitated, searching her expression. He had spent years believing she had abandoned them. Now he knew the truth. "Yes," he finally said. "But first, we fix this. Together." A tear slipped down her cheek, but she nodded. For the first time in years, Cody wasn't alone in this fight, and neither was she. Cody sat in the diner, his fingers wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Across from him, Evelyn fidgeted with a napkin, her eyes darting toward the back where Gray and Elena were resting. The tension in the air was thick, years of distance and unanswered questions still hanging between them. But for the first time, they were sitting together with a single goal: to give their children a future. Evelyn had barely spoken since they left the clinic. She had agreed to come, But Cody could see the hesitation in her every movement, the fear that had settled deep in her bones. She wanted to see them, but she was afraid of what they might see in her. Finally, she broke the silence. What do I even say to them? Cody exhaled, setting his cup down. The truth. She let out a hollow laugh. The truth? That I failed them? That I let them slip through my fingers? Cody met her gaze. That you never stopped looking. That you never stopped loving them. Evelyn swallowed hard, her hands tightening around the napkin. And if they hate me? Cody hesitated, glancing toward the storage room. They won't. But even if they do, they deserve the chance to decide for themselves. Evelyn nodded, her breath shaky. She wiped at her eyes and stood, smoothing out the wrinkles in her coat. Okay, she whispered. I'm ready. Cody led her to the back of the diner, where Gray and Elena were sitting at a booth, quietly eating the breakfast Stella had forced onto their plates. Gray was talking, animated for once, and Elena was actually listening, a small smirk playing on her lips. For the first time since Cody had met them, they looked like kids, but the moment they saw Evelyn, the lightness in their expressions vanished. Gray stiffened first, his eyes narrowing, his entire body tensing as if preparing for a fight. Elena simply froze, her fork slipping from her fingers and clattering against the plate. Silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Evelyn took a small, unsteady step forward. Hi, she said softly. Gray pushed back from the table, standing. His jaw was tight, his fists clenched at his sides. No. Evelyn flinched. Gray. No, he repeated, shaking his head. You don't get to do this. You don't get to show up after all this time and act like... His voice cracked, but he swallowed it down, his expression hardening. Where the hell were you? Evelyn inhaled sharply, blinking back tears. I was looking for you. Gray let out a sharp, bitter laugh. Looking? You lost me. You let them take me. Evelyn took another step forward, her voice desperate. I didn't have a choice. Gray's face twisted. That's bull... Elena suddenly stood, cutting him off. Stop, she said, her voice quiet but firm. Gray turned to her, his expression unreadable. You're seriously okay with this? Elena didn't answer right away. She looked at Evelyn, studying her, searching for something in her face. Cody held his breath, waiting. Then, after what felt like an eternity, Elena exhaled and asked the only question that mattered. Why didn't you come back for us? Evelyn's breath hitched, her hands trembling as she wiped at the tears she could no longer hold back. She looked at Elena, then Gray, her lips parting as if she had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times, but had never found the right words. Now, standing before the children she had lost, she had no choice but to speak the truth. I tried, she whispered, her voice raw. I swear to you, I tried. Gray scoffed, crossing his arms. Yeah? Well, trying doesn't mean much when you leave your kids to rot. Evelyn flinched, but she didn't back down. You think I wanted this? Her voice rose, desperation breaking through. You think I wanted to wake up every day knowing I had no idea where you were? Knowing that I had failed you both? That every time I closed my eyes, all I saw were my babies. My babies out there alone. Elena swallowed hard, her fingers tightening into fists at her sides. Gray, despite his anger, didn't speak, his jaw locked tight. Evelyn took a shaky breath. After I lost you, I fought. I fought so damn hard to get you back. I spent years searching, filing paperwork, meeting with people who didn't care enough to listen. And when I found out Elena was in the system, I thought at least she was safe. She let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. I thought she was better off without me. Elena's expression wavered for the first time. But you weren't, were you? Evelyn whispered. Elena hesitated, then shook her head. No. Evelyn covered her mouth, stifling a sob. I'm sorry, she choked out. I'm so sorry. Gray looked away, his shoulders tense, his breathing uneven. For so long, he had let anger fuel him, had let the resentment bury any possibility that maybe she had tried. Now, faced with the weight of her words, he didn't know what to do. Cody, standing in the background, felt something shift. This wasn't going to be a simple reunion. It wasn't going to be hugs and happy endings. But it was real. It was the start of something neither Evelyn nor her children had ever been given before. A second chance. Elena looked at Gray, as if waiting for him to say something, to let go of just a sliver of the rage he was holding on to. But Gray's emotions were a storm, crashing violently against the walls he had built for so long. Finally, he exhaled and muttered, I don't know how to do this. Evelyn wiped her face and took the smallest step forward. We don't have to figure it out all at once. Just let me try. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, to Cody's surprise, it was Elena who moved first. She took a single step, then another, before cautiously wrapping her arms around Evelyn. It wasn't much, wasn't everything, but it was enough. Evelyn clutched her daughter like she never wanted to let go again. Gray turned away, running a hand through his hair, his expression unreadable. But he didn't walk out. He didn't leave. And for now, that was enough. Cody exhaled slowly, a strange sense of relief settling over him. He had come here looking for someone to leave his legacy to, but he had found something much more valuable, a family he never knew he had. For the first time in his life, he wasn't looking back. He was moving forward. And this time, he wouldn't be doing it alone.